I will elaborate little bit more on ecosystem services to drive home the point why we need to be motivated to study ecology and ecosystems. There was an assessment by the UN which was carried out in 2001 to 2005 by more than 1500 scientists from all over the world, which is known as the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, to assess the services provided by, because we take it for granted. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was carried out by more than 1500 scientists. The reason is, like as I said earlier, many times we take it for granted what is provided to us, which is existing as the function of the ecosystem, which we take it for granted, and we do not give the due. In return, we are not respecting the fact that these systems have to exist for our well-being and existence as well. So, the reason why it is highlighted, and that is why more than 1500 scientists came together to assess what are the services provided by ecosystems, and how, for example, we can incorporate this into our the modern day economics, which many times ignore the fact that there are services provided by ecosystem. I will cite an example: pollution. So, for example, when a car which is made and which is polluting, who should be paying for it, and where should be who should be penalized for it? Should the car owner should be penalized, or the car manufacturer should be penalized, or the company which is producing the diesel or the gasoline should be penalized, or the governments which are regulating these things should be penalized? There is no end to this connection, that there are many users for this, and at the same time nobody is taking responsibility for saying that once we put the carbon dioxide or the sulfur dioxide or the nitrogen oxide into the atmosphere, there is no assignment of responsibility to anybody. So, it has to be taken care by the environment which is surrounding, that is what we call indirectly the ecosystem services. So, carbon dioxide, for example, the only natural way that it can be taken up is plants which can utilize carbon dioxide for photosynthesis and convert that into effective biomass or food. Whereas all other systems, when we try to, so that is why we also need to read the ecology along with the definitions for carbon footprint, and also another definition of ecological footprint that we will come to, and ecosystem services is one that leads to the definition of these terms like ecological footprint and carbon footprint, which is indirectly connected to the ecosystem services. So, the central premise of this Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, all the constituents of well-being, including security, basic materials for prosperity, health, good social relations, and even freedom of choice and action are directly dependent upon ecosystem services. So, whether we and our politicians know it or not, it is defined by Wendell Berry that whether we or our politicians know it or not, nature is party to all our deals and decisions, and she has more votes and a longer memory and a sterner sense of justice than we do. So, which is many times reflected when the processes the natural processes run amok. For example, when floods happen, when droughts happen, these are actually kind of the mechanisms with which ecosystems are trying to cope up with what we are doing, and when it cannot handle the system. So, it will go into runaway processes, that like we say in a chemical reactor. Let us say, if we do not, if it is let us say a process which is exothermic, and exothermic processes, for example, produce heat. So, if we do not control the heat which is produced in the system, the reactor can have a runaway process, and it can explode or it can cause problems. So, similarly, Earth's processes are also, as I said earlier, these are chemical and physical processes, and if we do not understand and if we do not take measures to see that what we are contributing as an agents of change to this ecosystem, it can result in runaway processes, which will be in terms of floods or droughts or unwanted temperature, where life cannot be sustained on Earth itself. So, Wendell Berry's work demonstrates that a farmer must have an intimate relationship. So, this is also saying what should be the relationship of human being with the ecosystems. So, he says, for example, a farmer must have an intimate relationship with his land and its secrets to sustainably reaping its harvest. A project site occupies a specific place in the ecosystem. The site may be characterized as belonging to a biome in ecoregion, a watershed. It may be just a farmland, but it is a part of a biome or what is known as an ecoregion, and maybe it is a part of a watershed. These definitions are important for us to know these in ecology. You need to know the definitions of these terms to understand what is a biome, what is an ecoregion or a watershed, and how our activities or acts, whether it is a farmland or another project that we are envisaging, how it can affect and how it can be in sync with the ecosystems that survive there. But also the site itself has defining characteristics relative to its contribution to the ecosystem. So, each site contributes to the ecosystem services of a place, and the interacting person, whether it is a farmer or whether it is an individual, has to see where that project is going to be placed, whether it is a an engineering project or whether it is a farming project. So, these are the systems, these are the events which interacts with the biomes, the ecoregions and the watershed. So, to understand ecosystem services, the ecosystem service is an output of, so ecosystem services are basically an output of ecosystem function. So, ecosystem is not doing a purposeful thing to give us a service, but it is just in terms of human parlor definition or human well-being, we require these ecosystem services. As you can see highlighted here, the ecosystem services is a result of the ecosystem function. So, which is a natural functioning of the ecosystem itself. So, as you can see, it is fed by what we call as biodiversity of the ecosystem. So, biodiversity has different things that we define in terms of the number of species, the relative abundance of each species, their composition and their interactions. All this together feeds into what is biodiversity, and in turn the biodiversity feeds into the ecosystem function. The function of the ecosystem is defined by the biodiversity of the place, and which can in turn being affected by so in back and forth. This, as you can see, these are all like system which has a relationship back and forth. So, biodiversity feeds into global changes of environment, for example, climate, biogeochemical cycles, land use and species introduction. So, basically it can feed into biodiversity and also it can feed back into global changes. Similarly, global changes can affect the ecosystem functions. So, as you can see, biodiversity affect global changes, which can in turn affect the ecosystem function and ecosystem service that is required for our well-being. So, human well-being is a key point here, which is dictated by biodiversity, ecosystem function, ecosystem services, and there is no other way that we can define this better. So, what are these ecosystem functions which are result of ecosystem function which results in what we call as the ecosystem services. So, the functions are of ecosystem. So, these can be elaborated, one can go and read more about it. So, they can be classified into 4 major categories. One is regulating functions, production functions, habitat functions and information functions. So, these are the functions of ecosystems. So, if you generally look at regulating functions, what are the kind of things which are regulated by ecosystems? So, for example, one is gas regulation in the environment. So, we all know that the carbon dioxide, the oxygen level, the nitrogen level, all these are regulated by ecosystems like plants, animals. So, for example, plants, we know carbon dioxide is taken up by plants during photosynthesis and oxygen is liberated. Similarly, when plants are during respiration, they take in oxygen and they leave carbon dioxide outside. Similarly, all animals and microbes, they take in oxygen and leave carbon dioxide outside. So, you can see the regulation of gas in the environment was, if we do not have any other external processes which are introduced by humans, let us say, and we had only living creatures which were regulating this. So, it was going on in a natural way in some sense, unless there are some catastrophic events like let us say volcano eruption or some catastrophic temperature changes on the atmosphere, in the atmosphere, etc., that could eventually, let us say, wipe out large populations of plants. Then it could have runaway processes, let us say carbon dioxide absorption changes, and it could lead to other processes. So, for example, though we say that we are heading towards another mass extinction, the sixth mass extinction, there were extinctions before also, which were controlled by this natural processes, which are kind of runaway processes in some sense. The earlier ice ages had more of carbon dioxide on the Earth's atmosphere, which was due to, for example, the tilting of Earth's rotation angle. So, which could change the temperature itself, and so this is a very finely controlled physical and chemical processes that goes on in the environment, which leads to the functioning of Earth itself and the living beings there. So, the gas regulation is an important function here, which if you go in and read, we will learn that how finely controlled is the concentration, for example, of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It is about 0.03% is only carbon dioxide, but when it shoots up by little amount, for example, if you turn it in terms of ppm, the 350 ppm is the upper limit that is set by scientists to say that in the atmosphere, that is parts per million, that is if you take million molecules of air, million parts of air, you will see 350 parts is only carbon dioxide. So, when it shoots up, let us say it becomes 400 or when it becomes 450, it is climbing up currently due to carbon dioxide emission from various industrial processes and other processes that we are engaging, other than the natural breathing in and breathing out by living systems. So, the gas concentration in the atmosphere is increasing, which can in turn affect the climate and other things. So, the climate regulation, the second point is climate regulation, which is finally dictated again by the gas regulation in the environment. Similarly, disturbance regulation, again to do with so if you consider any system, this is a dynamically operating system which has different time scales and different for the processes that is going on here. So, it can get disturbed from what is known as, there is no equilibrium states here, it is constantly in flux and it is moving, and different processes are going on the planet due to the contributions from different ecosystems which are interacting and forming the biome itself. And so, the disturbance regulation is another factor that is constantly at the back of this, which is a process that can be controlled by the ecosystem services. So, for example, if a system is disturbed, what we mean by disturbance is, let us say we cut down a forest for agriculture purpose. So, if a disturbance affects a particular ecosystem and if enough time is given, the disturbance, the system itself regulates it and takes control of it. Similarly, regulation of water, water supply, soil retention, soil formation, nutrition, waste treatment, pollination and biological control of organisms. So, all these are regulating functions, and which one can see in the ecosystem. If we look at ecosystem functions, it can be classified into different categories, as I mentioned, as regulating functions, production functions, habitat functions and information function. So, we have already discussed what are regulatory functions, where ecosystems regulate the gases, the system, water, the air, everything that we come across is regulated by ecosystem functions. And if we assume that if we have to generate all this on an artificial scale, it will be humongous cost. So, there was an experiment which was conducted called Biosphere to see whether it is whether it is possible to reproduce an Earth and in all its functions elsewhere, let us say in either in moon or in Mars or somewhere where we want to colonize, for example. So, if we have to reproduce all the functions so that we can have a living atmosphere and living planet there. So, this is an experiment that you can go and refer to, known as Biosphere 2, and which how much it costed is one of the reasons why it is very, very prohibitive in its economics, to know what is the function that is served by Biosphere 1, that is our planet Earth. So, when it comes to production functions as it is listed, ecosystems provide us the food, and so I was I am elaborating little bit on the food part. When we say food, okay, when we all eat either wheat or rice or some pulses and fruits and other things to supplement ourselves. But when we say that, you will say that it is actually produced by some farmer. Is that the truth, that this is produced by farmer, or is it by the ecosystem? Or it's a part of an ecosystem service. To understand this, let us say, what does the farmer do? Farmer has to go and sow some seeds, and will it grow or not is dependent on various other factors. For example, it is also dictated by the climatic functions. So, it is regulated by the let us say the weather, the local weather, whether it is going to rain more, less, whether it is going to be drought, whether it is going to be hot, whether it is cold, all this dictates whether the food is going to be produced. That is one of the functions that is dictated by ecosystem service, that is regulatory function. Second is that we all take it for granted. Let us say farmer goes and puts the seeds, and then he waters, and then he provides, let us say fertilizer, and then weeds, and he removes the weeds or whatever that is unwanted from the farm, and let us say he has this monoculture of let us say wheat or paddy or whatever that you are trying to grow. Will you get enough food? Nothing else is being done. You will get, but then what we are taking for granted is something called pollination, which is one of the very important functions that is served by the the ecosystem. So, where an invisible army of insects, like example honeybees or some other or various other insects which are involved, for example in pollinating plants. Pollination is one of the very important function which can be embedded in providing food for all living systems. Without pollination, there is no food. So, this is something that you cannot take out and say that I will eliminate all the insects because they all look like harmful to me. But so this is where we need to appreciate the function that is served by the insects or birds, let us say, or some other creature. So, which is not under our control, but it is existing there in the ecosystem which is providing the function. Similarly, all other raw materials that we have so many interconnections, as we have seen in the first slide, which is the biotic and the abiotic world is interacting, and these processes which you have seen in that slide, which is like the biotic and abiotic community, how they interact, is through millions and billions and trillions of microbes which are operating day in and out in the presence of oxygen and in the presence of absence of oxygen to convert the materials that we use and produce in back and forth into elements and being made available in the environment and in the soil for these materials to grow and food to grow and provide us a service. Similarly, the production function also involves, for example, the genetic resources that is available. So, why do we need to know about this genetic resources? So, we depend on a large number of genetic resources today for food growing as well as for various other requirements that we need to meet. Medicinal resources, that is another service that is provided through the function of production function. About 30% of current modern allopathic medicine is derived directly from plants itself. So, you can imagine how much of service that is provided, and if you scan through the remaining plants also, there will be many components that could be useful in terms of their potential medicinal value, for example. And ornamental is another production function where it is pleasing to our aesthetic senses. Similarly, ecosystems also function as habitats for us as well as for other creatures. So, one of the first function is as refuge. Refugium means refuge. It is a refuge for other creatures as well. Okay, so, where a bird should be living or an animal should be living, it provides the right refuge as a function, and which is very necessary for its well-being and in turn the well-being of the ecosystem and us. Secondly, it provides the nursery function. What is meant by nursery function is like the human nursery. The young ones need protection from whether it is an animal or whether it is a bird or whether it is some other young one. It needs protection from various other elements, maybe predators or from other environmental reasons. So, ecosystems provide the necessary protection function through the providing nursery. It serves also as information function. So, how information flows in the ecosystem, and which gives us what is known as the aesthetic information. Okay, when we see an object which is in nature, how do we appreciate it in terms of what is known as aesthetics? This is probably a human trait only to appreciate other creatures in terms of aesthetics. Otherwise in each species they have an appreciation for the male, female, which is mostly oriented towards the sexual and attraction. Otherwise in general human definition of aesthetics is to enlist certain components of nature as aesthetically beautiful. Let us say a river flowing, or a rivulet flowing, or a mountain range, or when we see a pond or a lake, we have an aesthetic value associated with it, which also is an important function that is served by indirectly served by ecosystems. And this is also serving here. This is when we are talking about this ecosystem services, which is mostly in the context of human beings. So, the other aspect of it is recreation. So, recreation is there in every other creature also. Like if you look around, they also recreate or do what you call enjoy themselves in nature. So, which gives you a lot of relaxation. So, basically this function served by it. Similarly, cultural and artistic information is another service that is provided by ecosystems. Spiritual and historic, and science and education. So, as I said, it is the science of the universe, and understanding nature itself and in detail is what every other branch of science is doing. Whether we are looking at ecology or not, when we go into every minute details of it, it is basically the science and education that is provided by as an ecosystem function, which we are using in terms of our understanding of the universe itself. So, as I summarize it, the biodiversity is at the heart of this service that is provided by ecosystems, and which is in turn which is due to the functions that is served by the ecosystem. Okay, the ecosystem works whether it is providing service or not, but all living creatures including us making use of this functions, and then which helps us our well-being. I have put a dotted line here for showing that human beings have an indirect connection to these global changes which are also affected. So, it is not only that this flow is like this and then reaching the well-being of humans, well-being of the ecosystems is also going to be affected by human beings. So, in general we are also affecting today the climate, as you would know, the biogeochemical cycles, our land use pattern is changing. We are introducing species to various ecosystems, sometimes with our knowledge, sometimes without our knowledge. These are all affecting the indirectly or directly the biodiversity, ecosystem services, and then so it is going in a loop. As you can see that how we treat the ecosystems will come back to us through this loop. So, that is why it is very important how we protect the ecosystems and how we keep the ecosystem services, the more intact the better. So, we should not be adversely affecting the ecosystem services by our acts.